drinking seesaw was going down more than it was going up. Too many days were being destroyed by drinking, and very little was being made better by it.
Well, Theo, thank you so much for joining us today on the Hurt to Healing podcast. It's very nice to see you in your very beautiful pink shirt, looking very suave. I have just finished your brilliant book, I Fear for This Boy, and I'd love to know where the title came from. I mean, I know you write about it, but for the listeners, I think they'd like to know where it came from. And why was this kind of a perception of you from such a young age?
Well, the title came from my final school report. It was going to be called, which it is still subtitled, Chapters of Accidents. But during lockdown, when I wrote it, really as a sort of, to give myself something to do, to stop myself lurching into indolence, which I thought I might do if I didn't give myself something, a project to do. During that lockdown, we found an old bag, an old sort of canvas bag with all my and my sister's school reports in it. And my sister, my two sisters, twin sisters, had the most unbelievably glowing reports. I mean, they couldn't have been more glowing. You know, they'd sort of captained the lax team and the hockey team, and they both won scholarships to Oxford. And I mean, just nothing better, could have been better. I mean, one of them actually said, to teach the Fennell sisters is one of the great delights of my teaching career. And then we got to mine, which were almost universally sort of poor, and in some cases really quite vitriolic. And I hadn't really realised I'd been quite such a sort of trial to so many teachers. I'd always thought I got on well with masters and what have you, although there were two simply appalling ones there, both interestingly drunkards. But my final report, very final report, which was meant to be a sort of 3-page character assessment, on sort of, good points and perhaps slightly weaker points, and where one might go in life, just had one sentence in it, which Louise my wife, found incredibly funny, which was, I fear for this boy. That's all it said.
And do you think you've played out that narrative in your life?
Without a doubt. I mean, I think it rather depends in what spirit it was made. I knew the man pretty well, and I think he realised that both my father and I would see through the sort of the kind of shortness of it, the brevity of it, and pack it, which we both did with all sorts of other meanings. But I think he was right. I think he feared that I wouldn't achieve what potential I might have had. I think he feared that I might go astray. I think he feared that I might mess things up. All sorts of fears, all of which were justified.
Yeah, because you write that you have always felt like you were the wrong side of disaster.
Yes, I mean, I think if you engage fully with life, which I have always tended to do, to sort of grab it with both arms, you find yourself in situations which perhaps if you were more circumspect, you wouldn't do. And I think I also took a sort of perverse delight in some ways of being in the sort of vortex of a disaster, because I think, it's a less dangerous place to be in the vortex than a sort of stander by, in as much as it's probably easier to be beaten up oneself than watch a friend being beaten up while being held back. So I always felt that if I was in the, in the swirl of a disaster, then I had some, although it proved many times not to be the case, but I had some control over it. And I think I always had a bit of a delight in sort of unfortunate circumstances, in that I normally find them very funny, and so found myself really as a sort of actor within a farce, and enjoying it rather than being too much trepidation, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you've had such a colourful life. I mean, I couldn't believe some of the sort of anecdotes and your trips to LA and Texas, and going with suitcases full of Oscar clothes where you had to unpack them at the airport, and you so happened to have two guards who sort of slightly relished in the fact that you were producing Joan Collins's sort of Oscar dress on one hand, and extraordinary.
Yes, I mean, I think in LA at the time, which was, I mean, in how many years it's been, LAX has gone from a essentially provincial airport to the sort of throbbing hub that we know now. In the same way that when I flew from London Airport in my youth, it was a sort of thing that would now be, again, a provincial airport. So it was a much more kind of laid back and altogether sort of less formal place. And it so happened that most of the guards, whether it was the uniform, I don't know, but most of the guards were wonderful and amusing queens who just loved working there. I mean, they did look, as I said in the book, they did look like the sort of seventh and eighth member of the village people. And for whatever reason, I've always found an empathy with such people.
Brilliant. So you were always creative, obviously, from a young age. And then you eventually opened your jewelry shop in 1982, I believe. And what sort of inspired that? Because I can imagine being a man of your sort of, in your social circles, it wasn't necessarily a sort of a route that people would have gone typically. So what was sort of your drive?
I think I had a sort of lateral drive rather than the forward drive. I think I was always very interested in lots of very different things. So consequently, I never sort of went in a sort of controlled or preordained forward way. I had no plan. I mean, never had a plan really. But I loved drawing. I loved painting. I loved playing the guitar and singing and writing excruciating poetry and all those sort of things. And I suppose I was what you would now call a creative. So going into the army was not going to be a good idea, I don't think. And my father, all my family were soldiers. My father was very sweet about it and said, honestly, I don't think you'd suit the army. And I think the time of career soldiers who could also be sort of soldier poets and be cultured and had gone. It was a very much professional army and all that sort of stuff. And I think, or a whole lot of sort of hoorays going in for a short service commission, and neither of those appealed to me. And he hadn't got any money, and fun enough, in those days to go into a sort of a decent regiment cost a lot of money, bizarrely, but that's how different things were. And I was sort of thinking of going up to Cambridge to read fine art and moral sciences, one of those things that obviously equips you perfectly for any business. My cousin, being a Don, had sort of arranged that. But then when I was asked what I really wanted to do, I said I wanted to go to art school. And in those days, there were many and various foundation courses, which were fantastic things and gave you a year, if you had, the sort of a modicum of artistic talent, they would take you on and you'd have a year of learning all sorts of very practical things like perspective, lettering, watercolor, pottery, photography, literally everything. And at the end of that, they normally assumed that you'd have found your métier and that somebody would say, very good watercolorist and you should go to so and so, whatever. But it was sort of the end of the 60s, the early 70s, and I really hadn't sort of found my métier at all. I just sort of strummed a guitar, I had a one-man band for a bit and those sort of things. But I don't think I was anywhere nearer thinking what I wanted to do. But I wanted to be in London, I think, as everybody did then. And I'd gone to Brighton to the art school there to see what it was like. And they were very, very, everybody at art school then sort of looked like they were a member of T-Rex. They all looked like Mark Bolan, or actually even the girls, almost everybody. had sort of glitter in their hair. And I went to Chelsea for an interview and I was interviewed by a sort of performance artist who was not wearing very many clothes, called Penny Slinger, who then became a sort of, used to photograph her parts and things like that, which I found absolutely terrifying. Having gone to a sort of all-boys school, I had found girls pretty frightening until York Art School, where I was one of very, very few boys there. And I was taken almost literally in hand by various of the girls doing things. I assumed everybody went there to be a painter, but they were doing things like, textile design and more pragmatic things. So I fetched up a place called the Barham Shore, which was off Kensington Church Street in those days. And Kensington Church Street was just the most fabulous place to be, because you had shops, things like Mr. Freedom and Tiger and the first Bieber, the very first Bieber store, and all those things all around, and Portobello Road at the other end, and it was just sort of very heaven. And I did pretty much nothing for about 3 years, apart from sketching a bit, dressing like an artist, and therefore being allowed to get away with almost anything, which was a wonderful thing, because my friends who were either at sort of somewhere like Cirencester or in the army, or at Oxbridge or whatever they were doing, or university, didn't get anything like the leeway that I got, being as how I was an artistic type, and therefore allowed to behave with immense sort of laxity. And at the end of that, I got a thing called a DIP-AD, which is Diploma in Art and Design, which doesn't exist now, which is about as much use, I would think, in job hunting as a geography O-level, something of that sort. So I was no further, ahead. I by that time discovered and rejected songwriting, poetry, novel writing, portrait painting, illustrating, literally everything. And I became that person that people discuss at breakfast. What are we going to do with Theo? While I was there, I am here. And my great aunt Mary sent me an advertisement from the Lady magazine, believe it or not. And she told me it came from the Lady. I thought I was going to be a valet or some sort of domestic, but it was for a silversmiths. In fact, the greatest silversmiths probably that there's ever been in Hatton Garden. And I went for an interview, and for reasons I've still never understood, they offered me a job. So that's literally how I came to be in the jewelry business. And after 2 very rewarding, in the sense of learning, years there, but on the sort of side of any ambition, thwarted completely. We weren't allowed to do anything they didn't tell you to do, as it were. I thought, well, I know enough about this now. I'll start my own business, and that's how it started. Happenstance. But going into the workshop there for the first time was a real epiphany. I just suddenly thought, this is wonderful. I love what they're doing here.
So Theo, you do speak in your book a lot about your drinking. And why do you think you started to become more reliant on alcohol? What did it serve in your life at that time? What purpose did it serve?
I've given it a lot of thought over the years, and I think I was always a sort of extrovert in an introvert's body. I know that sounds an absurd thing, but I was very shy, and still am to some extent, because many reasons, I suppose, but I developed very late, and my voice broke when I was very late, so I had a time of sort of being very nervous about getting to any sort of party or having any kind of, and I think, like many people, that sort of led one to develop a sort of another persona, which was the sort of slightly lippy, rebellious person, which bizarrely, I'm incredibly law-abiding. although there are lots of laws I think are absurd. So my triggers are things like unfairness, people jumping queues or people on scooters and on the pavement running into old ladies and things. I mean, it drives me absolutely berserk. I could probably resort to murder in either of those cases. But there was a drinking culture in my family. My family was of that sort, that had sort of, fought in the war and of that generation, that drank enormous amounts. What we think of as enormous amounts now, without thinking twice about it. So it was a time when, you went over to somebody to have lunch with somebody. You'd have a couple of drinks in their office, and you'd have, a bottle of wine at lunch and probably a brandy afterwards. So you'd be quite pissed through the afternoon and expect you to do some work, and then at 6 o'clock you'd start the whole thing again. So at home, certainly, the drinks were started at midday, even if we were sort of just doing nothing at the weekend. Do something in the morning, and then 12 o'clock suddenly, in those days, all sorts of bizarre drinks like gin and it and gin and Italian, gin and French and whatever would appear. And then actually not so much wine at lunch, but it was a culture that one was in. And then I very much loved pubs. I very much loved clubs. And I think, when I was at art school, I mean, everybody was drinking vast amounts as well as indulging in other recreational pharmaceuticals. So it was not thought of as odd to be pissed, especially for a man. I think it was very unfair in those days that a girl who'd had slightly too much to drink was thought of as somebody who'd lost control, whereas a man who hadn't was thought of as as a sort of funny, amusing person. I always found that very unfair even then. But there was nothing to say it was a bad idea. There was nothing to sort of lead one to believe that it was impacting on one's life at all. And I certainly found, I never drank on my own, bizarrely. I was never but I would go out and find a reason to drink. I'd go and find somebody to drink. And it was just part of my life, part of the culture of my life. And as one does, one found myself with other people who drink, and you enjoyed other people who enjoyed a club and a pub, and not so much the people who wanted to go home, and and it became very much a staple of every day. When one would go and have a drink and where one would go, and conversations about drink, and should we go to the this or that, or and conversations about how pissed one had been were part of the sort of fabric of life. And I think it did add to the jolliness of life. In retrospect, I if I'd been able to have youthful dalliance with booze, and then at sort of 30 started to grow up and perhaps control my drinking, I think I've nothing against people who are able to do that, and I think it's a wonderful thing if you can. I think if you can have a sort of glass of wine with your lunch and enjoy it, and you can occasionally get a bit tipsy, sort of Christmas parties and things, that then more part your elbow. But I couldn't. I didn't know I couldn't. But I just sort of, I would go on really till the cows came home, and I was, I got more and more happy. I find, and more and more, when I say experimental, I do almost anything under the influence of somebody saying, "Oh, let's go to whatever it is." I think it was a good idea. And I think so long as it was just me, it was, it could be annoying. And I think, no doubt, more grown-up people and more sensible people would have thought, that's not a good way to spend your life. But amongst my contemporaries, of friends and things, it was the way we all behaved, and so it just seemed to be the normal thing. And in fact, great opprobrium was heaped on anybody who said, "No, I've had enough," or "I don't drink," or "I'm going home." So it's a very different landscape, social landscape, certainly, in the 70s and 80s. And it was what everyone did. As I say, you went to your bank manager and you'd have a a drink and a ciggy, before he took you out to lunch and you got absolutely wasted. And nobody thought it was odd if you came back and said, God, I've been having lunch with my bank manager. It was an excuse for being, 3 sheets to the wind. So I think, it was a mixture of a sort of crutch in the way of getting me over any shyness that I suspected I had but didn't know, and of part of a very jolly, irresponsible, and, hail fellow, well met sort of culture.
So when did you identify that this was kind of actually becoming a bit of a problem and it was too much of a crutch and it wasn't serving you anymore? I mean, it takes quite someone who's, got quite a lot of inner strength to be able to, as you say, to step away from that and to actually be defiant in that, I've got to stop this because it's not serving me anymore.
I don't think I ever had a sort of, Damascene moment. I think what happened was that because one was surrounded by people who drank and by, as I say, a sort of culture of drink, it didn't occur to one that one was any different from anybody else. I mean, I think it was fairly obvious to most people that I would go further and perhaps be more ludicrous than most people and get into more scrapes, but only because I think I was sort of naturally more inquisitive. I mean, where people said, "Oh, you mustn't go there," I tended to think, "Oh, I think I must," rather than whatever. So I got myself into some very bizarre places. And some very bizarre things happened, none of which are in the book because I promised my daughters nothing that would embarrass them or anybody else. But it came to pass, as it were, that I got married. And for many years, we had a very jolly sort of mad social time, both of us. But then, life caught up. I mean, I never got hangovers. I never, I could always get up in the morning. I might feel a little bit, but I really didn't feel bad. And I never sort of passed out or, was ill or anything. So I think I had the misfortune to have a sort of constitution that could take it, as it were. So it wasn't so much a physical thing; it became a behavioural thing, and also a mental thing. And I think when the children arrived, which was sort of 8 years into our marriage, and by that time I was sort of mid-30s, it became obvious that one couldn't really continue to just be unreliable and stay out and be quite as self-indulgent as one had been, because it does lead to immense self-indulgence and a sort of very unacceptable solipsism that does make drunks very unattractive, but only to those who are not. And I found it more and more. I found the people that I was drinking with were limited, because the more sensible people, the more grown-up people had sort of begun to, understand that they should perhaps behave differently. So the kind of the sort of milieu in which one moved became a little bit more desperate. And I think it became obvious to me, much later than it had to Louise and to a few other friends, that things had to change. So I tried limiting, I tried, drinking less, I tried to discipline myself into not going to lunches, not doing whatever, but it was always far too tempting. And, I had a lot of sort of friends in the music industry and in, the arts and whatever, who had, a very undisciplined life, who could go to lunch and had nothing to do in the afternoon and, whatever. And it didn't matter if they turned up to the studio, in the most terrible state, because that's what they did. So it was very difficult to withdraw. Also, the culture was very different then. It was seen as a sort of, especially by one's drinking friends, I hasten to add, as drinking friends, it was seen as a sort of capitulation. And, if it seems so bizarre now, because if somebody said, young Johnny is allergic to oysters, but he's absolutely obsessed with them, and we're sort of, I don't want to eat oysters anymore. What a ridiculous boy. Or, he's a smack addict and he's giving up and whatever. And people didn't sort of, didn't cheer you on. They tended to think that's rather wet. And the whole idea of alcoholism was thought of as a sort of terrible weakness. And that the drying out, as it were, as it was called, as a sort of, slightly sort of blemish on your social behaviour. So it was an odd thing, but having given it sort of 2 or 3 goes, I realised that in the great tapestry of life, as it were, the fulcrum, the drinking seesaw was going down more than it was going up. And I think the realization was that too many days were being destroyed by drinking. Too many nice things were being ruined by it. And very little was being made better by it. So, in the sort of bank of booze, I suddenly got an overdraft rather than a deposit, if that makes sense. And a very obvious one. And so I just thought, or realized rather than thought, somehow this has got to stop. And then it just became a question of how best to do it once I'd made that decision. The things that came to mind that I suppose were most pressing, and it seems odd that they should be these, but I think it's the same for many people, were what do I do now? How do I behave now? Where do I go at lunchtime? What do I do in an aeroplane when they come around with the drinks trolley? All these extraordinary sort of things. What happens when I go and stay with Fred? I can't say I don't drink. What happens when people come and stay with me? What happens when the girls grow up and their friends come and say, they go, oh my God, it's a dry household or whatever. I sort of assumed that I was going into a sort of, a desert in which no booze could exist for anyone around me. I hadn't really thought it through. And I think the things that made the biggest difference to me were a friend who I hadn't seen for some time, who had got sober and pointed out the kind of processes and the tricks for it to appear that you weren't not drinking, as it were. To make no issue of it, to have a soda water with a piece of lemon in it, all those things that didn't put you in the line of fire, that didn't have you say, oh, for heaven's sake, they were ridiculous. Oh God, he doesn't drink, whatever. Just to, so those tricks of the trade, as it were incredibly useful. And the next really big thing was 2 or 3 people who I admired enormously, talking to me about the fact they no longer drank. I had no idea they no longer drank. And I could see how good their lives were. I could see there was life after getting sober, as it were. I could see that they were having a ball. And in a couple of cases, I could also see that people who had been really bad drunks, I mean, they'd been wonderful until, the turn, as it were. Then suddenly they'd been, absolute brutes. Really appalling. Suddenly weren't. They were suddenly, kind, funny, sympathetic people. And the empathy I felt with and for them was a terrific sort of balm, as it were. I had complete support from, obviously, my wife, and my daughters were too young then to really know. And I never got to the stage of them asking what was going on in the corner and being told that's your father. There was a sort of noise from the corner. But I did feel sort of bound to avoid some people who I knew would be troublesome. So there's no doubt, I didn't see some friends. In some cases, when I re-established the friendship, it was meaningless because it was only a drunken friendship. Places I'd been suddenly became unbelievably tacky and embarrassing in sobriety because everybody was very drunk and there was just rubbish being spoken. It was difficult to sit next to people at dinner that were very drunk to begin with, but only to begin with. But I got far, far more support than I did otherwise, and which surprised me. And suddenly started to find that not only was I coping after a few false starts, and I think people have to be sympathetic of a few false starts. I mean, nothing but false starts becomes very tiresome, and I think that the traps that people fell into around me that I was noticing, that I noticed most were self-pity. Why me? This is awful, whatever. Kicking against the pricks the whole time, just not being able to come to terms with the fact and just going on, and excusing too many false starts, as it were, too many wagons to fall off. So I began to watch those things, but once I'd gone through each of the sort of cultural hurdles, an annual golf competition abroad that I used to be in that was really an excuse for everyone to be unbelievably drunk for a week, getting through it, feeling absolutely wonderful and still having a terrific time, and finding that when I went to bed before everybody else, nobody noticed that I wasn't there. I mean, I'd felt as most gregarious drunks do, that you go to bed, the party stops, and that you're duty bound to stay there till the very last person goes. Because otherwise, A, the party will stop, and B, they'll know that you've gone to bed. Nobody even said at any stage, where you going? At breakfast in the morning, nobody even said, where were you? And in a way, that was an enormous sort of relief, because I thought, I just leave when I want. I can actually go to bed when I'm tired. So that became of enormous help. And then I was asked to make a speech at a wedding, and I thought, oh my God, how am I going to do that? And it went fine, and I was in control, and I thought, I can actually, sense the mood in here. I can, I'm aware of what's going on rather than just, spouting. So one by one, I suppose, over a 6-month period, I went through each of those hoops, the ones that I was worried that wouldn't happen.
And that gave you the self-confidence to kind of continue. And were you getting any support in the background? I mean, did you go into rehab, or did you get, a counsellor, or?
I didn't go to rehab, but my doctor, as it so happened, was a man called Robert Lefevre, who's still with us, and a wonderful man who had a thing called the Promise Unit in the old days. And Robert was my GP. It just so happened. And I'd said to him, one morning I'd gone to see him, I started to get hangovers for the first time, and they were really awful and unrecognizable, because, I just thought I was ill, and say to him, why do I feel so rotten, thinking I might have some sort of awful bug. And he said, well, you do smell like a brewery. Were you very drunk last night? I said, good Lord, yes. And he said, what time did you stop drinking? I said, 5 o'clock or something. He said, when did you get up? And I said, half an hour ago. This was sort of 8 o'clock meeting. He said, well, that may well be it. You have a thing called a hangover, and and we had a chat about it. And he said, and I said, do you think I should? And he said, you certainly give up. Yeah, without a doubt. And there's no doubt it's impinging on life. So he was very helpful in that way to show me the sort of form, because otherwise I wouldn't have known really who to talk to. I didn't know, obviously I'd heard of AA and all those things, but I'd never been. But he suggested I go to some meetings. And to begin with, having a sort of Calvinistic streak, I thought I would go to the really nastiest, toughest ones, just to sort of self-flagellate a bit. So I went to the ones in sort of, Stepney and, whatever, find people in the East End, and found myself amongst sort of people with brick red faces and, tattoos and one tooth who'd sort of, lived on the streets and whatever. And I found myself thinking I was a complete charlatan, because their lives had been dreadful. And to be honest, I walked away from the first ones of those thinking, right, no wonder you drink, mate. If you had life like that, I would carry on, which obviously wasn't very good advice. So, and I talked to a friend who I then was told, was in the rooms, and he said, no, you've got to go where you feel an empathy, go where you feel at one with the people. So I sort of went to various ones, and I have to say, in some I found some unbelievably self-obsessed people who were sort of just going through the motions because, they, whatever. I made a noise with my stomach. Rumbling stomach.
Oh, I had that, yes.
Did you? So I found some very, very self-obsessed people who I think needed a different type of format. They needed a one-on-one. They needed someone to shake them out of their self-pity. But I began to hear some really good stuff. Mainly that it does get better, which you don't believe to begin with. And, people there who were having an incredibly happy life, who weren't pie and religious and sort of, certainly weren't in any way trying to sell it, as it were. They were just, and I didn't find much proselytizing in those rooms at all. I just found, good common sense. And then I found a couple of meetings which were absolutely perfect, because people that I knew half of them, and, I'd been drunk with half of them, and they were all having a terrific time, and people I thought would never last the course. With their, having a terrific time, their jobs had come back, their marriages, their lives were back together. And I really did see the magic of it. I saw the magic of what sobriety does. I was terrified of becoming, too pie and sort of self-righteous. So I didn't really spread the word at all. I just kept it as a very, very private thing. And then found myself going less, simply because of force of circumstance, but thinking about it often. I find when I went abroad, I would normally try and, if I felt I was on my own and, that temptation might creep up on me, I'd try and find somewhere to. But I did find, occasionally just sitting on my own, considering things, with some of the processes that I'd learned, very helpful. I mean, I suppose like one might be if one was a more religious person, just slipping into a church and sitting at the back when there wasn't a service on, just to have a little bit of, time to think about things. So I did find myself becoming more considered, but also 10 times more productive, and far more creative, far less nervous about going to parties, dances, anything, because I hadn't really realized that the fear of drunkenness, the fear of putting one's foot in it, fear of missing appointments, the fear of organizing a trip from A to B was far, far more terrifying than the thought of going to a party without a drink. So that was the big turnaround.
Yeah, and you almost give yourself the momentum, the more you achieve and the more you can see your life, kind of, all these rich experiences sort of transpiring out of sobriety. It sort of gives you the momentum and the inner strength to carry on. And I think that's the beautiful thing about doing the 12 steps. as you say, it's having the community as well of people that you can look up to, that sort of act as mentors, whether it is a sponsor or people, as you say, old friends who you could never have imagined being sober and having these amazing marriages, suddenly their careers taking off. And that's why it does work for a lot of people, AA and NA, and the 12 steps is an incredible program. Did you have any relapses on your way to sobriety? Were there any moments where you...
I mean, before I got into a sort of more formal way of life and sobriety, certainly from the time I had first realized and accepted that I needed to get sober, I did. And they were nearly always not so much disastrous, but the remorse was so dreadful, and the sort of self-hatred of being such an idiot was so unbearable that I think I sort of really talked myself into saying, this is simply, this is mad. This is putting your hand in the fire again. So after that, it was really just the sort of discipline of not drinking or doing anything, but mainly of trying to begin with, find a lifestyle that was joyous without too many risks, putting myself too near temptation, and doing those things that were joyful. And I remember talking to a friend of mine and saying, some things just won't be the same. And he said, well, at 11 o'clock in the morning, say, you're by the sea on a golf course, it's 11 o'clock, the sun is shining, and it couldn't be more perfect. You don't need or haven't had a drink at that stage, but you're having this wonderful time. And he went through, half a dozen joyous moments, if you like, that he knew that would fill me with, sitting in the theatre, seeing a film, listening to music, whatever it is, and saying, that you get, how much more do you get out of it by being sober? Getting up in the morning and early to go and go for a walk or whatever it is. How much better is it without a hangover than with? So what is that period that is, that really gives you the joy? Maybe the occasional lunch, 3-hour lunch, or maybe the occasional dinner, or, sort of carousing evening. But it's minute in the whole. So you're not giving up a whole life, you're giving up very little. And another friend whose analogy was this, that you've been told you've got to go and live in another country, but it's not another country where the food is disgusting, where, it rains all the time, where there are no friends, whatever. It's another country where it's sunny, where the food is delicious, where it's just different people and a different way of life. It gets dark, a bit earlier, or stays light longer. It's just a really joyous place to be. And if you always hark back to, I've had to leave that country, as it were. So I think there were all sorts of things that helped, sort of mindsets that helped, until it became just a natural state of affairs. And I didn't have to think about it. I didn't have to think about, I shouldn't go there or whatever. And I found pretty quickly I had absolute confidence in myself to not relapse, to not have a drink for the hell of it. And then that sort of wondrous thing happened when you suddenly find you can't even sort of bear the smell of it. You can't even, the whole thing becomes as natural a state of affairs as drinking was before.
Yeah, it just doesn't appeal at all on any level.
Yeah.
And you started by saying that you were sort of introverted extrovert. And did you find that your confidence actually gained, it sort of almost gained more momentum as you got more sober, because actually you were gaining confidence through natural means based on your kind of your own talent, your own skills, your own innate character, as opposed to just conforming to what everyone else was doing and being the kind of, you know, the sort of maverick at the party.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I still find myself, you know, playing the giddy goat and sort of, you know, playing it for laughs and things. But my level of self-confidence, I don't mean sort of overweening, you know, dick swinging confidence, increase, but my own level of self-confidence of being able to cope with things, of being able to get, you know, make sure I'm utterly confident that I would get there, that I would do a decent job, that I wouldn't put my foot in it too bad, I wouldn't let people down, I wouldn't let myself down. That knowledge, yes, came with enormous self-confidence, because you suddenly thought, you know, I'm in control.
Yeah.
You know, I'm the boss here. The booze isn't the boss. I'm the boss. You know, if I don't want to go to something, I won't go. If I want to support a friend and I say I'll be there, I will be there. I became, as it were, trustworthy. And I became reliable. And although that's wonderful for other people, you know, who'd had to put up with some fairly, you know, cavalier behavior, it's also fantastic for oneself. You know, I can get on the train. I will, you know, I won't miss the plane. I won't, you know, I'll do these things. And it became much easier to order one's life and to just enjoy things, you know, and without a doubt, I find then, you know, giving speeches or doing things, because I was able to rationalize that, you know, anyone who gets up to give a speech, 90% of people are going, oh my God, you know, rather him than me or her than me. And so there's a sort of swell of goodwill that you feel anyway, just by getting up to sing a song, do a thing anyway. Everyone's hoping you do well, unless they're very unfortunate. So you're much more aware of those things, you know, because your senses are so dulled by alcohol or by drugs or anything that you don't feel what you think you're feeling. You know, and I have still so many friends who say, you know, I can't be creative without booze. The point is, you really are much more so. You just lie to yourself. You lead yourself to believe that you're more creative, funnier, whatever. I read a thing the other day, that 3 most unlikely things for a woman to say to a man, the third of which was, do have another drink, you're so funny when you're drunk. Second most unlikely was, why didn't you stay here and have some more drinks and take that young girl home? I'll make my own way. And the first one, I don't think I'm even allowed to say. How rude is it? Are we allowed to be here?
Yeah, you can say whatever you want.
And the most unlikely was, my, what a lovely scrotum.
I think, yeah, I mean, I do think it's so interesting how, as addicts, and, you know, I haven't struggled with alcohol or drugs, but, you know, I've struggled with other things. You have no self-belief. And actually, a lot of what is sort of masked by the addiction is this sort of, this crippling fear of who am I in the world, and you're sort of almost suppressing your personality, and as you come out of it and you suddenly realize that actually I can be responsible for myself and I can look after myself. I think that's what you're alluding to as well. I kind of really sense this feeling that suddenly you have these these tiny little epiphanies where it's like you say, I can get on the train, I can actually collect the kids from school on time, or whatever it is for people, and it's suddenly you do gain an immense amount of confidence yourself, and you sort of feel like you walk around with sort of halo shining, and although no one else can see the halo, your chest is almost swelling with pride, because it's like, I've done it, like I've actually behaved like a responsible human being.
Oh, absolutely. I think these little victories need to be celebrated. I mean, even not obviously, you know, as it were, in public with the giving of trophies, but I think, you know, to just pat oneself on the back and say, you know, I got the kids to school on time, whatever it is. It seems so absurd to somebody whose life is well ordered and what have you. But I think one does need to sense these as, you know, the tiniest little victories, but little tiny sort of, you know, cobblestones along the path of life. But I also think that one of the problems of any sort of addiction, anything that masks the real you, is that you can go the way of thinking drunk me is the best me, or addicted me is the best me. What I do when I'm drunk, write a song, read a book, write a book, build a whatever it is, I'm doing it best because my creative juices are being massaged by this addiction. And I think that's a solace to a lot of people who have addictions, that yes, it may be awkward, it may make my life very difficult, but I am a tortured artist, or I am a tortured accountant, or whatever you might be. And this is the only way I can do it. If I lose that, I lose my creativity, I lose my talent, I lose my whatever it is. And I think, one tends to use that as a sort of an excuse and a sort of crutch. And it does take a bit of time to get through that, in sobriety, to a thing saying, actually, this is the real me. The unfettered, unaddicted me is the real me. And then it's your job to make yourself the best you can be. Everybody wants to be the best them they can be, because the best them they can be in most people, I mean, the vast majority of people, is a really nice person, is a sympathetic and kind, thoughtful person. The vast majority of this world want people to live in peace, as it were, to have a nice time together, to be the best them they can be. And all sorts of things get in their way. It can be circumstance. But if it's not unavoidable, if it's self-inflicted, it's absolutely, it's an outrage, that one really does have to sort of look at and say, this is mad. I'm making myself into a bad me, as it were, when I really can be a much nicer, thoughtful, working, useful person. And I think as you start to go towards, it doesn't make you by any stretch of the imagination ideal. And I'm not saying for a moment, those who've been most successful at that transformation are suddenly saints and wonderful and whatever, but they're much better people, much happier people, and much more controlled people than they were before. Still have total lacks of self-control that but they're generated by circumstance on the whole, rather than as I say, self-inflicted. So I think that's the sort of wonder of it, is that you give yourself the opportunity to be the best you can be, and to look at your faults and say, why am I getting angry? Why does this trigger exist? Why am I being unreasonable here? And stand back, and makes it easy to apologize. And it makes it, you get into the habit, not all the time, it has to be admitted, but you do get into the habit of saying, oh, sorry, that was outrageous, I shouldn't have said that, or I'm so sorry about my bed. It is so easy to say that. Sometimes it's still very difficult to bring oneself to do it, and I'm not saying I do it all the time, but I'm talking about other people here as well as me. It does make it easier to see how abject one's own behaviour can be sometimes, and to do something about it rather than just walk away and say it wasn't my fault, it was theirs.
Yeah, absolutely. Taking responsibility for your actions and owning them is a big thing. And actually, it's kind of can be so cathartic sometimes saying, you know what, I'm wrong, I'm really sorry, rather than having that sort of angry, retaliation where it's sort of, it doesn't sit naturally, and you're kind of actually almost reinforcing the anger that you're feeling by not apologizing. And sometimes apologizing can feel so awkward, but it's actually such relief when you've done it.
It is the most cathartic thing. I think it's like an instant salve. It's like taking whatever that stuff you put on a toothache.
Oh, but Bonjela.
Or whatever. Yeah. I mean, it's just that instant thing that suddenly goes. It's quite extraordinary. I think, funny enough, I had a long conversation with a friend of mine the other day about the perfect sulk, and what the point of sulking was, and what does one hope to get out of it. And the perfect sulk is completely meaningless. It's for no point at all. It's just a sulk, because nobody is aware of why you're sulking. if everybody knows it's because you didn't get the last sweet, or because, you haven't been asked to something, or somebody was sort of slightly rude to you, then it's not an ideal sulk, because then everyone knows what it is. They go, well, he'll get out of it, or, we can get him out of it by saying, oh, you can come, or you have the last sweet, or whatever it is. The perfect sulk is the one where you just go into a sort of state of and just look glum and bring everybody else around you down into that feeling of disgruntlement. And when they say, what's wrong, you can genuinely answer, nothing. Just, and it's something I do almost hardly at all now. It's something I used to do a lot. Was the sort of really high level sulk.
It's almost like you're kind of blaming everyone else for your woes. It's sort of like,
that's what it is.
And I want sort of everyone else to sort of come in and feel the pain with me, and then somehow fix it and bring me up again. So Theo, I know that you were a creature of extremes when you were drinking, and I think every addict has that element in them. It's that reckless streak and that ability to push ourselves right to the edge and to take these risks that a lot of people would look upon as being highly sort of irresponsible and ridiculous, and also really pushing the boundaries. I think a lot of that is alluded to in your book, with like sort of not paying hotel bills and and a lot of that I sort of I relate to in ways that I probably shouldn't be talking about on this podcast. But what gives you that sort of immense pleasure now, and sort of what brings you the most amount of joy to your life in terms of just things you look forward to, things that you on a daily basis think, God, I'm really lucky to have that?
Oh, without doubt, my family is the absolutely sort of the most important thing in my life by miles. And I've been just incredibly lucky to have a very close, this generation, when I say this, Louise and I, and our children and grandchildren, things are incredibly close. I don't come from a particularly close family, although I've become very close to my sisters in my dotage. But she comes from a very close family, so she knew how to do it. I didn't. I had no idea how to sort of, be a father and share my feelings and that sort of thing at all. But she made it very easy. So that's by far the most important thing. After that, I love what I do. So long as I'm doing what I love, rather than the sort of business side of it and the sort of, the administrative side of it, I'm incredibly happy. But I also love thousands of things. I'm mad about many sports. I'm mad about cinema, music, playing music, talking, walking, just everything. I just find so many things in life utterly fascinating. I find new interests all the time. I read a lot, and that sort of sets me off on various paths and what have you. So I can't imagine how anybody can say they're bored. I can't imagine how anybody doesn't fill a day, even if it's walking around London looking at the buildings or whatever. So I think I have a really sort of curious mind. I still find risk captivating, and I think I take them naturally. But I think I have a sort of break now where I didn't before. I think I have a natural sort of you're going to hit this wall rather than will the wall go or will I attitude. So I do tend to stop. I tend to learn lessons much more quickly and see other people's points of view. But I love, I just love being engaged. I love being, part of the world, part of all sorts of things, friends who do wonderful things. It's wonderful to have those vicarious joys as well in other people's success and also in what they do, just loving what they do, their books or their music or what have you. I just, I just find there's not enough hours in the day, as it were.
Life sounds very rich and very fulfilling. Yeah.
I'm not sure how fulfilling it is. I think, I do a lot of stuff. What comes out at the other end? Not sure.
And are meetings still a part of your life now, or have you sort of...
Very, very rare. Normally, if I'm abroad, and as I say, if I'm on my own, which hasn't happened, obviously, with all that sort of stuff, but I really get enough from friends and family. I have, very close friends who are still in the rooms on a regular basis, and I find just being with them interesting. I have enough people that I could talk to. I mean, my family included, if I felt that was the case. But I think it's sort of, it's been 23, 24 years. It's a long time, so it's not. It's a large part of my life has been this way. My adult life, certainly, it's half my adult life at least, has been spent sober rather than not. And so I'm just used to this life. Certainly, given that when I gave up, I was sort of approaching middle age, the sort of, I suppose, the autumn of my life has been spent sober. The winter, I don't know what's going to happen then, but anyway, so I find I can cope with, disaster much more easily. And in the end, I suppose one looks back on all the things that worried one and all the things that one spent so much time terrified of, and wonder what on earth that was all about, because it just seems so unimportant now. Once you realise what the really important things are.
Gosh, well, Theo, you've been so generous with your time, and I can't thank you enough. You're just I could sit here and talk to you for hours of riveting stories, which I'm sure everyone else has found absolutely enthralling too. So thank you so much for coming. And I hope, the first of many conversations.
Wow, it's been a joy. Thank you.